2. This is the second part of the lecture on the psychological demands of dance and education. Perfectionism. Perfectionism is a personality trait characterized by striving for flawlessness and setting excessively high standards for performance, accompanied by an overly critical evaluation of one's own behavior. Striving for perfection may underpin personally important accomplishments that align with one's values and therefore relate to other adaptive outcomes. However, unremitting criticism and self-worth tied to achievement mean that perfectionism may also undermine the quality of a dancer's motivation and underpin their psychological difficulties. While perfectionism is a personality characteristic that may energize, heighten achievement striving and lead to considerable success, it may also elicit a range of maladaptive processes which undermine motivation, impair performance, and contribute to a psychological distress. While striving of this nature may be necessary to perform at a highest level, when it becomes compulsive, it may also give rise to debilitating consequences. There has been a lot of research in sport, and it has been suggested that when striving is underpinned by perfection, it may induce behaviors that undermine the quality of athletes' motivation and over time may lead to chronic disaffection and burnout. Hall and Hill, in their 2012 paper, state the one school of thought which holds that perfectionism may be manifest in either adaptive or maladaptive forms. Others, however, reject the idea that perfectionism reflects an adaptive quality, and they consider perfectionism to be a broad dysfunctional characteristic. Now, perhaps the most critical feature of perfectionism is a commitment to flawless performance. And we know as performers and as teachers, that is just not possible. When reading Mainwaring's 2009 paper, the description of an environment to which aspiring dancers are regularly exposed, she claims that trainee dancers enrolled in ballet schools and preparing for a professional career in the arts are constantly socialized to adopt perfectionistic beliefs and values as a consequence of the learning environment to which they are exposed on a regular basis. The evidence suggests that perfectionistic individuals often endorse a potentially debilitating pattern of approach and avoidance goals, which leads them to strive intensely to achieve success in order to achieve failure. It seems that when perfectionistic performers exhibit both a strong ego orientation and lower perceptions of ability, it contributes to increased symptoms of athlete burnout. Now, we've just discussed before that the classic description of perfectionism includes setting very and high standards and various forms of concern or doubt regarding actions and achievements. Now, since the paper, for example, from Carr and Wine from 2003, the understanding of perfectionism has since been featured by dividing it into perfectionistic strivings and perfectionistic concerns. Perfectionistic strivings comprise the goal-directed aspect of perfectionism, such as setting high goals, wanting to be perfect, holding oneself to high standards, and working very hard. Perfectionistic concerns are more varied. Concern over mistakes is key, but perfectionistic concerns may also comprise negative reactions to imperfection, doubts about actions, need for approval, and or perceptions that others expect one to be perfect. Now here, in the current way of looking at perfectionism, there is either one can be a perfectionist and one cannot be a perfectionist. There is no adaptive or maladaptive. To better understand the current thinking around perfectionism, we need to go and look at the authors Goodrow and Thompson from 2010, as they developed a 2x2 model of perfectionism, which allows researchers to examine the interactive effects of perfectionism striving and perfectionism coping. In the model, perfectionism is characterized into one of 4 subtitles. The first, pure personal standards perfectionism. Second, mixed perfectionism. And the third, pure evaluative concerns. And lastly, non-perfectionism. Now we'll go over those in the next slide. These core components of perfectionism can be captured by differentiating 2 positively related higher order factors. The first, personal standards perfectionism, and evaluative concerns perfectionism. Now, personal standards perfectionism involves a family of traits encompassing the tendency to demand perfection of oneself and the propensity to hold unrealistically high expectations. Now, personal standards perfection is a double-edged form of perfectionism. On one hand, it's associated with negative characteristics, processes, and outcomes such as neuroticism, brooding, and depression. However, on the other hand, it's associated with positive characteristics such as conscientiousness and task-orientated coping. Now, when we look at evaluative concerns perfectionism, it involves a constellation of traits comprising the tendency to perceive others as demanding perfectionism. These people have overly negative reactions to perceived failures and feedbacks, and have doubts about their own performance abilities. Evaluative concerns perfectionism clearly represents a negative form of perfectionism, showing strong and consistent associations with negative effect and various indicators of psychological maladjustment. As we discussed in the last slide, let's look at these 4 subtypes of perfectionism. Researchers have begun to examine the interactions between evaluative concerns perfectionism and PSP, personal standards perfectionism, in relation to psychological outcomes. Doing so allows researchers to test the relative importance of different combinations of evaluations concerned perfectionism and personal standards perfectionism in the 2x2 model of perfectionism. Now, the models include 4 perfectionism subtypes. And now, as we said, pure PSP, personal standards perfection, has a higher PSP and a lower ESP, evaluative concerns perfectionism, which is really the bad one. Then, if you have a pure ECP, you have a high evaluative concerns perfectionism and a low personal standards perfectionism. Now, if you have a mixed perfectionism, you have a high PSP and a high ECP. And then you have non-perfectionism, which is a low PSP and a low ECP. So we go back to that, there's actually no maladaptive and adaptive perfectionism. You either have one of these 3 types of perfectionism, or you are not a perfectionist. Now, in Norden Bates' paper and from 2017, she examined all burnout symptoms and found that dancers with pure ECP reported higher reduced sense of accomplishment, devaluation, and emotional physical exhaustion than dancers with non-perfectionism. However, findings from Quested et al. From 2014 suggested there is some support for the model in relation to similar outcomes in dancers. Specifically, they found that dancers with a pure PSP reported higher levels of intrinsic motivation than dancers with non-perfectionism and higher levels of self-esteem than dancers with mixed perfectionism. Therefore, at least there is some indirect evidence that the perfectionism subtypes within the model may explain aspects of the adaptive outcome of engagement in dances. Norden Bates et al. In 2020 state that the motives of non-perfectionists can sit alongside self-regulation in the pursuit of excellence. From an applied perspective, it highlights that striving for perfection is by no means the only way to strive high. Therefore, dance teachers should guide dancers towards goals that are high yet realistic and not least individually meaningful. When goals are reached, but also when working well towards their goals, dancers should be encouraged to feel proud and satisfied. It became apparent during these studies that perfectionistic striving can energize and drive a performer forward, but are not entirely positive. For instance, rigidity and perhaps even obsessiveness appeared to accompany the work ethic of the pure personal standards perfectionistic dancer. There have been several others who have spoke about perfectionistic striving might lead to problems such as exhaustion, injury through overwork, and in various ways restricting a person, which resembles other findings in the performance arts. It is interesting that a high self-regulation, non-perfectionist dancer strongly questioned perfectionism as a suitable goal for dancers and linked perfectionism striving to low self-esteem. In sum, Norden Bates has reservations around Goodrow's and Thompson's hypothesis that pure PSP is healthier than non-perfectionism, and does not agree that perfectionism striving should be promoted. Instead, Norden Bates et al. Proposed that perfectionism striving may be positive to a point, for example, contributing to hard work. Beyond that, it becomes counterproductive, which leads to rigidity and maybe injury. As we've spoken about, Nord and Bates suggest strategies for alleviating perfectionist concerns include helping dance focus on present moment aspects such as artistry, and to include creative exploration in classes, as doing so may help reduce perfectionistic thinking. So let's move on and discuss about the Big Three Perfectionism Scale from Smith et al. This introduces a new measure of perfectionism and was developed to provide a fine-grained analysis of multi-dimensional perfectionism. Now, in the Big Three Perfectionism Scale, there are three high-order global factors: rigid perfectionism, self-critical perfectionism, and narcissistic perfectionism. Now, within these three high-order factors, there are 10 lower-order perfectionism facets, and we'll look at these now. Now, these 10 lower-order perfectionism facets are self-orientated perfectionism, self-worth contingencies, concern over mistakes, doubts about actions, self-criticism, socially prescribed perfectionism, other-orientated perfectionism, hypercriticism, grandiosity, and entitlement. Now, rigid perfectionism is composed of two of these: self-orientated perfectionism and self-worth contingencies. Self-orientated perfectionism refers to the belief that striving for perfection as well as being perfect are important. Self-worth contingencies refers to the tendency to base self-worth on self-imposed perfectionistic standards. Now, within the self-critical perfectionism, there are four facets: concern over mistakes, doubts over actions, self-criticism, and socially prescribed perfectionism. Concern over mistakes is the tendency to have overly negative reactions to perceived setbacks and failures. Doubts about actions reflect uncertainties about performances. Self-criticism measures the tendency to engage in harsh self-criticism when performance falls short of perfection. Socially prescribed perfection denotes a tendency to perceive others as demanding perfection. And the last, narcissistic perfection. Now, narcissistic perfectionism comprises other-orientated perfectionism, hypercriticism, entitlement, and grandiosity. Other-orientated perfectionism is the tendency to hold unrealistic expectations for others. Hypercriticism involves harsh evaluation of others and their imperfections. Entitlement refers to the belief that one is entitled to perfect or special treatment, and grandiosity denotes a sustained view of oneself as a perfect or superior to others. Now, if you would like to do the big three perfectionism scale, you can have a read of the paper and have a go and then maybe reflect on what your scale is. If you don't, please don't do it if you don't feel comfortable. Let's go back and discuss approaches to feedback when working with students. Buckwood 2000 has proposed that in student dances, adaptive learning may be fostered and debilitating practices eradicated by the creation of a performance environment where a sense of agency is encouraged through personal responsibility, where autonomy for development is facilitated, and where individuals feel that they are valued by others. Of course, here we are again talking about self-determination theory from Ryan and Deci. Now, the theory, of course, posits that when social conditions support individuals' fundamental needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness, they will promote adaptive human functioning, which leads to both psychological and physical well-being. Clearly, if performing artists perceive that their learning and performance environment presents optimal challenge, a sense of autonomy and a sense of connection with others, not only will intrinsic motivation for the activity remain high, but it will reduce the likelihood that perfection will affect the appraisal process, thought basic needs, and give rise to motivational debilitation. It has been argued that the culture of perfection exists in dance, and it actually has been pushed. But we know that it has harmful consequences for the dancer's well-being. Findings suggest that the detrimental relationship shared between perfectionism and burnout were buffered when dance teachers provided autonomy support. The potential benefits in terms of reduced burnout and improved engagement suggest that teachers should acknowledge their dancers' perspective and encourage problem solving. Before we finish, I'd like to introduce the psychological profile wheel from Taylor and Estenol. Now, we have ebook access to this book, and it is a nice book written for students as it directly talks to the students, and it provides them with tools to enhance their psychological skills. Now, for example, here the authors have identified 12 mental factors that influence dance performance. Now, using these definitions, they ask the young dancer to rate themselves on each from a scale from 1 to 10. Consequently, it gives the dancer a very clear picture and an instant picture of where they need to improve. If they want to share it with you as a teacher, it gives you a very good idea of also where that student stands, and if they're being realistic. The 12 factors we'll just quickly go over are self-knowledge, motivation, confidence, intensity, focus, emotional mastery, communication, social support, pressure management, mental skills, and prime dance. Maybe if you would like, you could do the psychological profile wheel yourself. And once you have completed the profile, indicate 3 focus areas that you have identified in your prime dance profiles. Now, as you improve in these areas, identify new areas for work and complete the form again and specify your new priorities. So it just keeps going. So, of course, I would never leave you alone. So for the task, I'd like you to read the 3 big perfectionism scale paper from Smith et al. And the Norden Bates paper, Striving for Perfection or for Creativity. In the forum, I would like you to make either a video where you discuss or a PowerPoint that explains how you would build a creative task in your genre of dance that would aid in perfectionism thinking, and then post it to the forum with that written support of 200 words. Now, maybe you will need to focus on one type of perfectionism within the 3 big perfectionism scale. The task should include a reflection on the papers. Now, if you would like, you could actually do the questionnaire and reflect on your results. But please, if you don't feel comfortable, this is only an option and you do not have to do it. The deadline for the task is the 23rd of April. Now, if anyone has actually done the questionnaire, we could actually do a workshop and analyze and how to analyze that questionnaire. And lastly, instilling young dancers with basic psychological competencies and confidence in their abilities that will support them as they continue into this highly competitive and sadly perfectionistic career is fundamental to us as dance pedagogues. Thank you very much for your attention. Please take care, and here are my references.